Good afternoon, college students. Hope you had a good 3-day weekend. Hope you got some rest. Maybe had a little bit of good, safe fun. You know, it's a pandemic and all that stuff. Okay. Hopefully you weren't too swamped with work. I tried to give you a break. I didn't want you to read over the weekend. I hope you were able to read at least some of chapter 5. I'm very impressed, and I tried to send out a message to this effect yesterday. I'm very impressed with the job that chapter 5 does with the events leading up to the American Revolution. I don't know that I've read a better textbook accounting of events in terms of the clarity of explanation. Now, that doesn't mean it's the most readable. There might be textbooks that are more readable. As a matter of fact, I think the American Pageant might be more readable, does a little better job of telling a story, but I was very impressed with the information that was present in there. Okay. Now I'm going to lecture you on some of that stuff today. I know it's tough to start off Monday with a Zoom lecture, but that's how it worked out in schedule. But your only homework will be to respond to that, assuming I remember to get it gosh dang posted. Hopefully I'll get it posted this time. I'm going to go for about a half hour and then I'll stop. I don't know that I'll get everything in, but I won't go much past 2:30 here. Just need to get to a certain point. Tomorrow you're going to be creative. I don't do a lot of creative stuff with my college kids. It's kind of a traditional lecture discussion course. Obviously, but tomorrow you're going to get a little bit creative. I want you to create an accurate representation of the Boston Tea Party. Okay. Or, I'm sorry, the Boston Massacre. And I'll explain that tomorrow. Something the kids have enjoyed doing in the past is kind of a break from the routine assignment. Okay. I like to try to weave some of those in at least throughout this course. We'll do that tomorrow and we'll show and tell those on Wednesday. Okay, Thursday would probably be more lecture again, either finish this one or get to the Revolution. And then Friday, I wanted to take a look at Common Sense. I think that was the primary document we were going to look at this week is an excerpt from Common Sense, but we'll see. That may change. Okay. Oh, speaking of which, we're a week away from coming back. Okay. So let me show you something really quick. There is one business item. Oh, you know what? Let's do that tomorrow. Let me get to my lecture today. Let's just do my lecture today. I'll show you that tomorrow. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'll have more time to do it tomorrow. Okay. I want to get as far with this as I can today. Okay. So this is chapter 7. I'm recording this. I'm going to try to remember to post it because I would really like to hear your comments on this lecture. Okay. This is a little bit more meaty than the last one. Okay. So I want to remind you of some things that happened with the French Indian War and the results of that are really key going forward. Okay. Remember, after the French Indian War, I want to remind you that patriotism is strong. Okay. The patriotism of the English, the patriotism of the colonists following the French and Indian War, but there were tensions that remained. The English had been looking down upon the colonists. Even George Washington, people like that had to take secondary roles. The two big sources of tension are the Proclamation line that's established at the Appalachian Mountains. And your text did a really good job. Once again, better than any textbook I've read, describing the conflicts on the frontier that were occurring. With the ending of the French Indian War, the natives had lost that ability to play off French-English rivalries with each other. The Native Americans, whether they sided with the British or not, were really at a negative. And the French Indian War is very much a negative result for them. And the English, including some English elites like Washington, had land interests in that Ohio Valley region, in that Great Lakes region. And so they had no desire of being restricted to not being able to cross the Appalachian Mountains. And the reason why the English adopt that proclamation line, which is well explained in your text, was because of those constant wars of the frontier that were occurring. And it's basically English troops that are dealing with a lot of that. And so that's expensive, right? The English are trying to cut costs. The reason why they're trying to prevent expansion is because of the constant wars on the frontier that are occurring. And the fact that troops are in those forts, the French once occupied, and all those things. So really the central issue is cost. The English are in debt and they're trying to cut costs. But the colonists, who have an insatiable desire for land, don't want to be stopped at the Appalachian Mountains, okay? So they're going to defy that proclamation line quite frequently. And of course, the big issue I already mentioned, debt, right? And so taxation is going to be a big issue. And from the English perspective, you got to try and, when you look at history, you got to look at all perspectives, and every side labels the other side as evil, right? I mean, that's what happens. We're going to label the English as evil, and they're going to label us as unruly and all that stuff, right? Repressive versus rebellion. But from the English perspective, they felt that the colonists should share in some of this cost because they had protected them from the French and Indians. And so one of the things that's going on here, before I get to the first act I want to cover, I guess I'm telling you a lot before I start showing you some notes, sorry, but is that there had been these navigation laws that have been passed way back in 1686, right? And now we're up to 1763. Those navigation laws were meant to control colonial trade somewhat for the benefit of the profit of the empire, but they hadn't been very strictly enforced. And one of the things coming out of the French Indian War is the English are going to try and more strictly enforce those navigation laws. So that's going to be a source of tension as well. There's 2 acts that are passed before the one I'm going to show you here in a second. The Sugar Act is the first attempt at direct taxation upon the colonies from the British. And then also the Quartering Act. And those were passed in 1764. Notice the distance here, right? I'm talking 1764, Declaration of Independence isn't going to happen until 1776. So this is quite a distance in causation for revolution, but there's quite a distance there, over a decade. But the Sugar Act had been passed in 1764, and then of course the Quartering Act, which we kind of look at the Quartering Act now as, how could they just make troops live with people? That was a way to cut cost, so the expectation was that the colonies would house British troops, because now the British didn't have to pay for it, right? They didn't have to pay the cost to house their troops. And from the British perspective, the troops were there to protect them anyway. Colonists kind of viewed the troops as an intrusion, though, right? So there's a different perspective. And it's not like these troops are always living in people's homes all the time. Sometimes the expectation was they put them up in a barn or something like that. But still, it's an inconvenience. It's a colonial expense, okay? And the British are trying to save money. Now, of course, the first act that is the real big deal is the Stamp Act of 1765. So that's where I wanted to start today, although maybe I kind of started with other stuff that rammed in my head there really quick. But the Stamp Act of 1765 is seen as the most intrusive, because all legal documents had to be printed on paper stamped. All legal documents had to be printed on paper, were stamped with the seal of the government. So you had to put a stamp on anything that was legal, anything that was paper. The common explanation as to how intrusive this was, you even had to put a stamp on die, right? Dice for card playing games and stuff like that. They're typically about 1 cent, okay, which is a lot more back then, of course. So this is quite an expense, right? But once again, the empire is trying to generate revenue. And then the other key to it here is the fact that this issue of trial by jury. Judges ruled on their innocence or guilt. So this is going to be a big deal among the colonists. And you see this repeated in your text, where all these laws are being passed, okay, where you're not getting jury privileges. Or if an English soldier violates a law, like if they kill a colonist for whatever reason, they're tried by an English magistrate, not a colonial one. So you're seeing these sources of maybe justice not being carried out as fairly as it should be. Now, we've been dealing with a lot of protests this past year, a lot of events and protests that have gotten out of hand. Peaceful protesters doing the right thing, but maybe some rioters attached not, debating whether or not we're responding appropriately with our legal forces, right? Protest is nothing new, right, in United States history. The reaction to the Stamp Act is going to be a great amount of protest. Okay, we're going to see a Boston crowd destroy watermark paper to be used as stamps. So we've got civil disobedience, or what they would call civil disobedience, going on here. The attitude of Parliament and the people in England is that they had already paid a similar tax. Why wouldn't you pay it? The issue is, as I'm sure you know about, based on some of your previous studies of the American Revolution, is that this is a direct tax that is undermining local assemblies. Okay. This is taxation without representation. The colonists had not been taxed directly by the empire yet. And this, we see the Sugar Act doing this, and now we see the Stamp Act doing this. And they don't have representation in Parliament, right? And so that's the key issue. That's the key issue. Now, the English always like to use this phrase called virtual representation, that members of Parliament were elected and they virtually represented the colonists, but that wasn't formal, right? It's interesting, sometimes if you look at the components of, like, if you would have had representation in Parliament from the colonists anyway, they still would have been outnumbered in terms of representation in Parliament, so maybe it wouldn't have worked in their favor anyway. But this is the rallying cry that's going to exist through, of course, through much of the events leading up to the revolution and during the revolution. Okay, trying to pause here a little bit because I see some of you writing stuff down. And once again, try to read your text, because I don't want to just rehash the textbook for you. I'm just pulling some of the things I pulled out of it. But your text details is stuff more than I do. Important to mention Patrick Henry. Your text once again mentions him. Patrick Henry and others are opposed to the Stamp Act. It's really important to mention Patrick Henry here, because he gives a speech where he basically has 7 resolutions against the Stamp Act. He was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. That is the legislative body of Virginia, so like the elected representatives of Virginia. He gives a speech that is very fiery, and he's accused of treason. There are those English officials who want to arrest him. They don't do so. But this is one of the addresses that will be central in, once again, establishing that notion of taxation without representation. You probably know Patrick Henry, his famous phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death." That's not going to happen. This is 1765. That's not going to happen for another 10 years. But this is kind of his first thing that gets him on the map, giving this 7 resolutions against the Stamp Act speech. We have a Stamp Act Congress that forms in 1765. Delegates from 9 colonies meet in New York. And they essentially agreed. This is kind of just like a statement of protest, I guess you would call it. The delegates agreed that Parliament had no right to issue taxes, such as a Stamp Act. And once again, taxation without representation. Just repeating that constantly here, I suppose. There were 27 delegates there. And what's interesting about this, of course, is I talked in my last presentation, or maybe in some of our discussions last week, about, seeds of rebellion. The Stamp Act Congress can kind of be seen as a second attempt at unification, and maybe working better than the Albany Congress did, which is what Ben Franklin proposed during the French and Indian War. But we kind of see a step towards unification. And what's happening is, the more these delegates meet together, because they're coming from different colonies across the Eastern Seaboard, different sections, but as they meet together, they're finding that they have a lot in common, at least in terms of political beliefs and some of the same challenges, some of the same grievances that they have with the king. And so the more they meet, the more we see there's definitely strong differences among the colonies, but there's definitely some unifying themes that are developing. Okay, a little bit more. Text does a good job at this. I was impressed reading it over the weekend. I can't stress that enough. I know you guys are busy, but try to read it. Stamp distributors were threatened with violence. Many resigned their commissions. Samuel Adams becomes a key figure here. Samuel Adams is one of our early masters of propaganda against the crown. He's become a master of that propaganda. And what's happening is people are essentially refusing to pay the tax, or preventing them from collecting the tax. So people are refusing to pay the tax, and they're preventing tax collectors from collecting the tax. Okay, this picture was in your text. It was talked about. This is Commissioner of Customs John Malcolm, who's being tarred and feathered for trying to collect duties in Boston. Now, tar and feathering, maybe that doesn't sound like a big deal, but imagine having tar put on your body and feathers stuck to it, and then peeling all of that off later. Tar and feathering is a very painful thing. Okay. They were threatening to hang him if he did not apologize and renounce his commission. He actually refused to do this until they threatened to cut off his ears. I guess his ears are really important to him. So once they got to get ready to cut those ears off, he said, "Okay, I'll quit my job." Okay. So, and the thing is, these commissions, these tax collecting commissions, were quite lucrative. The English gave these men a good salary. So resigning these jobs could be quite a downturn in your standard of living, right? So you can see why they would resist it, whether it's on principle or just because they wanted to maintain their lifestyle. But nevertheless, he's forced to do so. He liked breathing, liked his ears. Okay. All right. The key thing early on is just going to be boycotting. That's going to be the key deal to get England to repeal these acts. And if you notice, England does give in. They do give in. There's kind of a back and forth here. England tries something, colonists protest, they say, okay, we won't do it. And so we see a repeal of the Stamp Act. Several colonial merchants threatened to boycott the British products, potentially hurting Britain's economy. We see a series of non-importation agreements that'll be passed, meaning we're not going to bring in any British exports. This is a boycott agreement. This is an agreement from colonial merchants and colonists themselves, where they're refusing to buy British goods. And once again, this is a step towards colonial unity. And English merchants will be hard hit by this. I looked up some figures here, guys, and maybe they're in your text, I can't remember, but 1/4 of British exports and half of all shipping were devoted to colonial trade. So this is a big deal. English merchants in the United Kingdom, right, in England, they don't want to lose this profit. And so what's going on here is you've got the colonists with their boycotts, right, refusing to buy goods, and that's pressuring Parliament. And then you got the people in England themselves like, hey, half my profits are gone because I can't sell stuff in the colonies. How about we repeal that Stamp Act? So the members of Parliament, the King, they're getting a lot of pressure from their peoples, not just in the colonies, but also back in the mainland empire. Okay, so Parliament does repeal the Stamp Act, but it declares a declaratory act, which is kind of just a strong statement like, we have the right to legislate the colonies in any manner that we see fit. Because the debate that's going on here is colonial houses of burgesses, colonial assemblies are saying, we will govern the colonies directly, you have no right to do so. And Parliament's saying, we have the right to govern you as how we see fit. And this is kind of like a statement of that. So what's the tension here? Once again, colonists want a sovereignty of their own. The English are refusing to grant full representation, and that's always a sticking point. Kids always ask me, why don't they just give them representatives in Parliament? And my answer is, I don't know. Maybe some of you know more about that than I do, but it is interesting that the decision was never made. Okay. All right, so the next source of grievance is the Townshend duties. Notice, England tries something, colonists protest, take it away. The next step in English trying to do something, mainly to get income, is the Townshend duties. Now, the Townshend duties are named after Charles Townshend. Charles Townshend is he is in control of the British Ministry of, he's called the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Okay. Basically, he's in charge of economic and financial interests. He served under William Pitt. So William Pitt is prime minister, and this is 1867. You might remember him of French Indian War fame, William Pitt. He's back in England now. He's prime minister, but he's old. Your text says he's got gout, which is like a foot infection that comes and goes. It's painful, very painful. He's just not interested in too much direct control, so he leaves that to Charles Townshend. So Charles Townshend, these duties are taxes, right? Charles Townshend's still trying to get revenue for the crown. So he's going to tax glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Tea is a big one. The thing you need to know about tea is, and you probably already know this, but it's a very common drink, of course, among the English and the colonists. So common that it affects every class. So every social class is upset about this one. Okay, lower, middle, and upper. This is what originally England wanted, was tea to become like a staple beverage because they're generating so much revenue that way. Okay, so people aren't liking this taxation. We complain about taxation now, right? The other thing was Charles Townshend was seen as getting more direct control again because he wanted the salaries of colonial governors to be paid by the crown. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal, but up to this point, salaries of colonial governors who are appointed by the crown, they're appointed by the crown, so they're not directly elected. those salaries are paid by colonial assemblies. So it'd be like our state legislature controlling Governor DeWine's salary, right? Okay, which maybe they do, probably do, but that was the case here. Now, colonial assemblies like that. They like being able to control the governor's money, because then they felt like they could control how he might rule on things. And so this, which doesn't seem like a big deal, is a way, once again, from the colonial perspective, of England trying to govern too directly. The issue is for years, the colonies have been left to govern themselves, and now with the French and Indian War, the crown's trying to take more control, and it's kind of like a spoiled kid, right? They're rebelling. Okay. Anyway, okay. So, towns and duties repealed. Once again, more direct revenue, more direct control. Protests, they back off. Boycotts of British goods are reinstated. Non-importation agreements are reinstated. Colonial subjects, colonial people, colonial merchants, they stop purchasing British goods, and towns and goods will be repealed. Taxes on tea remained. Smuggling became widespread. And this is kind of a big one too. 4,000 British troops were sent to Boston to restore law and order. There'd been a series of protests at this point. This happens in 1768. I'm going to quote one of my sources here. Liberty-loving colonists resented the presence of the red-coated ruffians. They taunted the bloody lobster backs unmercifully. Keep that in mind for what you're going to do tomorrow. Okay. And by the way, somebody who's really profiting off smuggling at this point, maybe you know this, is John Hancock, who you may know as the biggest signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's got that nice big signature on that. He's a smuggler. He's smuggling in tea from other places besides England and some other goods as well. So he's making a lot of money. So he doesn't like the restrictions on, basically, now why is John Hancock smuggling? He doesn't like the restrictions being placed on where he can get goods from. He doesn't like that at all, or who he can ship goods to. He wants that freedom. So he's going to smuggle. Okay, now, this next event I'm going to mention just briefly, which may surprise you because it's a big event, but the reason for that is you're going to spend some more time on it tomorrow, okay? And of course, I'm talking about the Boston Massacre. So this English and American tension will lead to the Boston Massacre. Boston's redcoat residents hated the redcoats. Maybe that's kind of a simplistic note there, but it's just kind of like this constant presence of troops in town. They're always on the streets, they're always around, and there's a resentment there. Okay. Now, the British subjects in town are always taunting these soldiers. They're throwing stuff at them, things like that. So this is definitely a clash that results from a two-way tension, one could argue. But that clash, nevertheless, and it's a tragic clash, occurs on March 5th, 1777. We end up with 11 colonists wounded and 5 dead. Now, that's all I'm going to tell you for now. And there's obviously a lot more of this story, but that's all that needs to be told here, because you're going to tell me more due to a Boston Massacre creative research assignment I'm going to have you do tomorrow. And we'll start that in class tomorrow, and you can get her done, and you'll get it done in one night. It's not too bad. Paul Revere creates a propagandist engraving here. I mean, this is propaganda. Now, what makes it propaganda is it's not entirely accurate, right? And so I want you to take a look at the accuracy of it tomorrow. But he creates it 3 weeks after this event, calls it the Bloody Massacre on King Street. You can make an argument that maybe this is the most effective piece of propaganda in U.S. history, okay, because of what it leads to. You can make an argument for that. There's been other pieces as well, of course. Okay, maybe Uncle Tom's Cabin. I don't know if that's propaganda. That's actually pretty accurate, but okay. All right, tensions continue. I got about 5 minutes here, kids, and I'll shut up for the day. Tensions remain very high following the Boston Massacre, right? The committees of correspondence form. Now, the committees of correspondence is another step at unity, okay? But actually a pretty strong one. If you notice, if you read that chapter 5, you notice there's times that letters are being sent from colonial officials, right? And that becomes kind of like an official organization called the Committees of Correspondence, formed by Sam Adams. This resulted in exchanges of letters, articles, anti-British propaganda, right? And these would be circulated among colonial officials, right? And this is a solid step towards unifying the colonies. So these end up in the hands of colonial officials. They end up circulating through communities, right? Posted on things, okay? So they're drumming up support for, well, whatever, eventually independence, right? Information was exchanged, opposition to British policies was coordinated. All colonies are participating in this by 1774, except Pennsylvania. Notice we're getting closer and closer to Declaration of Independence, right? Okay. That brings us to another event. Boston Tea Party, okay? Parliament passes a Tea Act in 1773. Notice the Committees of Correspondence actually form after this, I guess. Actually, the Tea Act can kind of be tough to explain. The textbook does a good job with it. But basically, the deal with it is it gave a monopoly to the East India Tea Company. And so they were able to sell tea at cheaper rates in the colonies than colonial merchants themselves, or what smugglers were able to do, okay, who were smuggling in tea, because these smugglers, they're making money through other tea companies around the world, and they don't want to just rely on the East India Tea Company, right? And the people in town, maybe they want those other teas too, right? Choice is great. So once again, read your text. There's an excerpt I could read to you, but I don't want to do that. So the British East India Tea Company is allowed to sell tea at cheaper rates. So merchants, smugglers, or supporters are forcing some of these ships to turn back. Some do manage to make it in and dock. And the Sons of Liberty respond with the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, actually December 16th of that year, okay? What you got is 100 Bostonians dressed as Indians, I guess for intimidation purposes, I don't know, smashed 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the Boston Harbor. Several hundred watched from shore and were like cheering them on, okay? And once again, so, why is tea a big deal? Taxes on tea, the cost of tea, who could sell tea, all that stuff is affecting everyone, rich or poor. So all classes are involved in this, okay? All classes are involved in this. All right, one more slide to go. And then I can stop for the day. I'll need to present the rest of this later this week because I want to talk about Lexington Concord and the advantages that the colonists had against the British and vice versa with the coming conflict, okay? But we're just dealing with tensions today, right? So following this event, we see a series of what are called intolerable acts. Now your text starts out calling them the coercive acts. The coercive acts are what the British call them. The colonists call them the intolerable acts, which your text once again does portray that. So the intolerable acts lead to the closing of Boston's port in 1774. They also made Massachusetts less democratic. Let me see if I can explain this to you. The intolerable acts removed the charter and rights of Massachusetts. They restricted town meetings. If an official, soldier or otherwise, killed a colonist in the line of duty, they were sent to England for trial, so they would not be tried by colonial juries and colonial magistrates, colonial courts. I mentioned that to you earlier. So direct control, why is England coming down on Massachusetts? Because this is the source of, Boston Tea Party, Boston Massacre, right? The Massachusetts colony is seen as being the source of rebellion. Okay, so they want to send a message. Okay, what's the colonial response? We see the First Continental Congress in 1774. Obviously, another step in unity. Oh, there's also more quartering of soldiers going on here with the Intolerable Acts. I forgot to mention that. Now, this First Continental Congress, to clarify, this is a consultative body, not a legislative one. So they're just advising and talking to each other and they're not passing laws. Not yet. Okay. That's not going to happen until independence. Okay. They're going to meet from September 5th to October 26, 1774. They're going to draw up a Declaration of Rights. Samuel Adams played a key role at this Congress. He keeps coming up. And in those Declaration of Rights, they're going to express a series of grievances to Parliament, and they're going to petition the king to address those grievances. Obviously, the colonists are not going to be happy with his response to those grievances. You guys know the story that's coming up, right? Okay. All right. So I'm going to post this, I think. Please respond to with any questions. I'm not asking you guys any questions during these Zoom lectures. It would be tough. I don't know if I could get an answer anyway. If we're in class right now, I'm asking you a lot of questions during these lectures. It's not just me rambling. So I want to post it and see what questions you might have of me, or even if you just post things you find interesting, and I'll give you 10 points. Hopefully I'll remember to do that this time, but that's your assignment for tonight. Okay? Any questions, kids? All right, I see some people shaking their heads no. Thank you for paying attention to me. Hopefully you're able to. I'll see you tomorrow. Bring your creative hats tomorrow, okay? Bye-bye.